What if a bank manager walked out of the vault with stacks of cash, stuffed them into gym bags, left them in a public restroom, and then calmly said, "I had the authority"? Would you call that a misunderstanding, or would you call it a system failure? Now ask yourself this. If the highest office in the country treats classified intelligence like personal luggage, what exactly is left of the rules? This is not a normal hearing. This is not a routine investigation. This is a stress test of whether the system can hold power accountable when power decides it is the exception. And the name at the center of this case is Donald Trump. The timeline is not vague. It is precise. January to February 2022, Donald Trump leaves the White House with 15 boxes of official records. Not symbolic documents, not press clippings. Classified material that federal law says must remain under government control. No exceptions? No loopholes? No, but he used to be president. The National Archives and Records Administration identifies the removal. They escalate to the Department of Justice. The DOJ brings in the Federal Bureau of Investigation. August 8, 2022, the FBI executes a search warrant at Mar-a-Lago. This is where the narrative stops being theoretical and becomes physical. 11 sets of classified documents recovered. Not one, not two, 11. Some marked top secret, some tied to highly restricted intelligence programs. The kind of material most officials will never see in their entire careers. And where were these documents stored? In a ballroom, in a bathroom, in storage rooms, in private residential spaces inside a resort where people come and go every day. Let's slow that down, because this is where the logic starts to crack. A bathroom, not a secure facility, not a classified information room, a bathroom, where guests walk in, where staff clean, where anyone attending an event could be within arm's reach of national defense information. That is not a gray area, that is not a paperwork dispute, that is exposure. Now listen carefully to what was said publicly. Supporters argue that presidents have authority over classification. What was not said? That this authority does not extend beyond office in a way that overrides federal law on retention and security. That it does not explain why documents were allegedly shown to individuals without clearance. That it does not justify storing sensitive intelligence in uncontrolled environments. The gap between what is said and what is not said is where the case actually lives. Because this is not about one box. It is not about a transition mistake. This is about volume, location, and repetition. 15 boxes removed, 11 classified sets recovered, unknown quantities potentially moved before the search. That is not accidental, that is accumulation. And here is where the pressure builds. In a typical political scandal, the assumption is simple. A subordinate makes a mistake. Leadership distances itself. But this case flips that script. Reports indicate that aides inside the system were trying to prevent the removal of sensitive materials, trying to contain, not enable. So now the question changes. If the system is trying to restrain the leader, who is actually in control? And while all of this unfolds, the public conversation drifts toward foreign conflicts, toward headlines about Iran, toward noise that pulls attention away from the core issue. But the core issue does not move, because at its center is a simple, uncomfortable reality. Classified documents were taken, they were stored in unsecured locations, they were handled in ways that contradict the very protocols designed to protect national security. And the person accused of doing it is not a low-level official. It is the former president of the United States. So before we go further, before we even touch the charges, the indictments, the intent, answer this first. If anyone else had done this, would we still be debating what it means? So now we move past the discovery and into what the system does next when the facts stop being deniable. June 9th, 2023, federal prosecutors act, not with vague language, not with political statements, but with charges. 37 felony counts filed against Donald Trump, later expanded to 40 as more evidence surfaced. This is where the conversation should have become simple. Retention of national defense information, obstruction of justice, false statements. These are not abstract accusations. These are specific violations tied to specific behavior over a defined period of time. And here is where the tone shifts into something closer to a courtroom. Because when prosecutors lay out a case, they do not rely on emotion. They rely on sequence, consistency, and contradiction. Let's stack the evidence. First, the removal. 15 boxes taken after leaving office. Second, the recovery. 11 sets of classified documents found during the FBI search. Third, the alleged actions in between. Documents moved, boxes relocated, instructions given to others to shift materials before they could be reviewed. That is not passive behavior, that is active interference. Now layer on the detail that changes everything. According to the indictment, Donald Trump allegedly showed a document described as a military plan to individuals who did not have clearance. Pause on that. Not stored, not forgotten, shown. That is intent expressed through action. And here is the line that matters, the one that cuts through every defense. If you know a document is sensitive enough that it cannot be shared, and you share it anyway, what exactly are you claiming you misunderstood? Because this is where the internal contradiction begins to collapse. Supporters argue declassification authority, but declassification is a process, not a retroactive excuse. It requires documentation, it requires communication, it requires acknowledgement within the system that the status of the material has changed. What we do not see in the record is evidence of that process being followed. What we do see is behavior that suggests awareness. Boxes being moved, responses being delayed, statements being made that later conflict with physical evidence. That is not confusion, that is pattern. And when you add obstruction into the equation, the legal landscape shifts. Because mishandling alone can be argued, it can be debated, it can be contextualized. Obstruction cannot. Obstruction implies knowledge of wrongdoing. It implies a recognition that what exists, if fully revealed, creates risk. Now consider the setting again. Mar-a-Lago is not a closed government installation, it is a private club. Members, guests, staff, vendors, event attendees moving in and out daily. Weddings, dinners, gatherings. And within that environment, documents marked at the highest levels of classification. Not hypothetically at risk, physically accessible. This is where the gap between language and reality becomes impossible to ignore. Public statements attempt to frame this as overreach, as politics, as selective enforcement. But physical evidence does not adjust itself to fit a narrative. A document in a secure facility is protected. A document in a bathroom at a public venue is exposed. There is no middle ground between those two conditions. And this is the moment where the system is supposed to assert itself. Not politically, structurally. Because if the same actions produce different consequences depending on who commits them, then the system is not functioning as law. It is functioning as preference. So the question tightens. If the charges are this specific, if the actions are this documented, if the contradictions are this visible, what exactly is left to reinterpret? Or more directly, at what point does explanation stop being clarification and start becoming avoidance? And just when the case seems fully laid out, just when the structure of evidence feels complete, a new layer is introduced that does not weaken the case, it sharpens it. March 2026, Jamie Raskin releases a letter based on additional findings from the Department of Justice. This is not commentary. This is not opinion. This is a continuation of the record. And what that letter reveals forces a different kind of question, one that moves from what happened to why it happened. According to that letter, some of the documents retained by Donald Trump were so sensitive that only 6 individuals in the entire United States government had clearance to view them. 6. Not a committee, not an agency. 6 people. Now place that fact next to the earlier image. Those same categories of documents allegedly stored in a bathroom inside a private resort. That is not just mishandling. That is a collapse of containment. And then comes the detail that turns concern into alarm. An allegation that a classified map was shown to passengers on a flight in June 2022. Passengers. No clearance, no authorization, no operational necessity, just proximity. And this is where the logic stops bending and starts breaking. Because there are only 2 possibilities when material of that sensitivity leaves controlled environments. Either the individual does not understand what they are handling, or they do, and they act anyway. Neither scenario supports the defense that this was routine, accidental, or within acceptable boundaries. And then another thread emerges, one that prosecutors are still examining but cannot be ignored. The potential connection between some of these documents and business interests. This is where the case shifts again, from national security risk to possible motive, because mishandling can be explained as carelessness. Retention combined with selective exposure raises a different question. Was there value in keeping these documents? Not symbolic value, not historical value, practical value. And if there was value, who benefits? This is not a rhetorical flourish, this is a prosecutorial pivot. Because once motive enters the frame, every prior action is reinterpreted. The movement of boxes is no longer just relocation. It becomes control. The delay in returning materials is no longer oversight. It becomes retention with purpose. The sharing of documents is no longer anecdotal. It becomes distribution. And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to dismiss. documents taken, documents stored in unsecured locations, documents allegedly shown to unauthorized individuals, documents potentially linked to personal or business considerations. Each element alone can be debated. Together they form a chain, and chains are not judged by individual links. They are judged by whether they hold. Now step back and look at how this is being discussed publicly. The conversation drifts toward complexity, toward legal nuance, toward competing interpretations of authority. But complexity can be a form of camouflage, because underneath all of it, the facts remain direct. Highly classified materials left government control. They were not immediately returned. They were not consistently secured. They were at times allegedly displayed. And the individual at the center of this sequence held the highest level of responsibility for understanding the consequences. This is where the moral contrast becomes unavoidable. An ordinary intelligence officer mishandles one document, and their career ends. Clearances revoked, access terminated, legal exposure immediate. Here, we are not talking about one document. We are talking about volume, repetition, escalation. And yet the outcome is still being debated, not decided, debated. So the question evolves again, not just what happened, not just why it happened, but what happens next if this does not produce a clear boundary. Because systems do not fail all at once. They fail when exceptions become precedents, and precedents become expectations. So ask yourself this: if the most sensitive information in the system can move this freely, be stored this casually, and be discussed this openly, what exactly is still classified? And more importantly, who decides when the rules apply and when they simply don't? And this is where the story stops being about one man, one investigation, one set of documents. This is where it becomes a test. Not of politics, not of personality, of the system itself. Because everything you've heard so far, every document, every location, every allegation leads to one unavoidable comparison. An intelligence analyst mishandles a single classified file, their clearance is gone within hours, their career is over within days, and prosecution is not a debate, it is a process. Here, we are not talking about one file. We are talking about 15 boxes removed after leaving office, 11 classified sets recovered during a federal search, allegations of documents shown to unauthorized individuals, and potential links between retained materials and personal interests. And the response? Still unfolding, still debated, still negotiated in the court of public opinion. That contrast is not subtle. That contrast is the entire point. Because law, by definition, is supposed to be consistent. If the same action produces different consequences depending on who commits it, then what you have is not law. You have discretion. And discretion, when applied unevenly, becomes something else entirely. Now layer in the real-world consequence, because this is where the moral frame locks into place. When classified information is exposed, the damage does not appear on a headline the next day. It appears in compromised sources, in intelligence gaps, in operations that suddenly stop working. It appears in people. People whose identities were protected until they weren't. People who relied on the assumption that the system holding their information was secure. You don't see their names on television. You don't hear their stories in press conferences. But they exist at the far end of every security failure, and they pay for it first. So while the conversation circles around authority, process, and politics, the underlying reality remains brutally simple. Information that should never have left controlled environments did leave. Information that required the highest level of protection was stored in places that offered none. Information that should have been restricted to a handful of cleared individuals was allegedly shown beyond that circle. And the system is still deciding what to do about it. That hesitation is not neutral. That hesitation sends a signal, not just domestically but globally. Because every adversary watching this does not care about internal debate. They care about outcome. They care about whether the United States enforces its own rules at the highest level. If the answer is unclear, then the vulnerability is clear. And that is the part that does not get debated enough. Because this is not about left versus right. This is not about party versus party. This is about whether the framework that protects national security is applied universally or conditionally. And once you introduce conditions into enforcement, you introduce uncertainty into the system. And uncertainty is where systems begin to break. So now we arrive at the only question that actually matters. Not whether this case is complicated, not whether the defenses are persuasive, but whether the standard is real. If the same evidence, the same actions, the same sequence would lead to a clear outcome for anyone else, why is the outcome here still a question? And if that question remains unanswered, then the implication is not subtle. It is structural. It means the system does not just enforce rules. It chooses when to enforce them. So before you move on, before the next headline replaces this one, before attention shifts again, decide what you believe the standard should be. Because if the law becomes conditional, it does not weaken quietly. It disappears. And if you believe accountability should not depend on status, then this is the moment to say it clearly. Like the video if you think standards should apply equally. Comment your perspective, because this conversation only matters if people engage with it. Share this so the focus stays on the facts, not the noise. And subscribe, because the next breakdown will go even deeper into what the system reveals when it is pushed to its limits.